The year is 1815 and Napoleon Bonaparte, the Emperor of France, has escaped from Elba with the aim to return to power. On the 1st of March 1815, he landed at Caen with 1,000 men, winning support from the peasantry as he marched on Paris. The army sent to arrest him even gave their allegiance to Napoleon. After resuming power, Napoleon decided to go on the offensive as the armies of Great Britain, Prussia, Austria and Russia were assembling along the French front due to invade, but had to wait for the Russian army to march there. This gave Napoleon time, and he decided to attack the British and the Prussians in southern Netherlands in the hope of defeating them before the Austrians and Russians could bring their forces to bear. Two armies stood in his way. Both were of dubious quality. The Prussians under Marshal Blucher numbered 120,000 men with some inexperienced conscripts, and the Anglo-Allied forces under the Duke of Wellington, with 93,000 of which 31,000 were British. Most had never been under fire. 29,000 were Netherlanders under William Prince of Orange, who served under Napoleon little more than a year before. The remainder of his army was made up of 16,000 Hanoverians, 6,800 Brunswickers, and 6,300 of George III's German Legion. Together, they outnumbered the French 128,000 men. Napoleon's best chance of success was to keep them apart and defeat them separately. Napoleon crossed the River Sambre on June 15th, entering modern-day Belgium. The very next day, the main part of his army defeated three of the Prussian corps, numbering some 83,000 men at Ligny, with losses of 10,000 French and 12,000 Prussians, with a further 8,000 deserting during the night. Blucher's troops fought stubbornly, but they lacked the skill and stamina of the French veterans. Napoleon could have achieved a total victory, as his plan of attack hinged on the use of a corps under Marshal Drouet to shatter the Prussian right flank. Drouet's corps were attached to Marshal Ney's command. However, a series of conflicting orders from Ney and Napoleon led to Drouet spending June 16th pointlessly marching and counter-marching between the two battlefields. With this, Blucher's forces were able to retreat towards Wavre, with 33,000 French under Marshal Grouchy in pursuit. The same day, Wellington beat off a separate attack led by Marshal Ney on the crossroads of Poix-de-Bras. But with the Prussian defeat at Ligny, it meant he also had to retreat in fear of being outflanked. Ney did nothing to stop Wellington's orderly withdrawal from Poix-de-Bras, and the eventual French response was slow due to torrential rain and skillful rearguard action from the Allies. Wellington and Blucher remained in regular contact, and with the promise of reinforcement by the Prussians the following day, Wellington ended the 17th encamped in a strong defensive position along a ridge south of Mont Saint-Jean. On the 18th of June, Wellington drew up his army along a ridge of Mount Saint-Jean. Using tactics that he had perfected during the Peninsular War, he positioned most of his forces behind the ridge so they were out of sight of the enemy and sheltered from artillery fire. Two advance posts located 500 yards in front of the main line added strength to the position, which proved critical in the battle to come were the chateau at Hougoumont, and roughly 1,100 yards to the east the farm and sand pit at La Haye-Sainte. Less important outposts were the farms of La Haye and Papelotte farther to the east. Although Wellington had made expert use of the terrain, his 67,661 men and 156 guns would barely make do to preserve his front until evening against Napoleon's 71,947 men and 246 guns. Napoleon drew up his forces on the southern ridge centered on La Belle Alliance, 1,200 yards south of Wellington's position. Prior to launching an attack on the British line center, Napoleon issued orders for a diversionary action against Hougoumont. However, due to the waterlogged terrain, Napoleon was forced to postpone the commencement of hostilities. At 11:35 am, the Battle of Waterloo saw its initial shots fired by one of Marshal Honoré Charles Reille's artillery divisions. This began a mismanaged attack on the chateau, which would absorb an increasing number of French troops without drawing defenders from Wellington's center. For an hour and a half the battle raged, confined to Hougoumont. At 1 p.m., when Napoleon was about to order the battery of 80 guns near La Belle Alliance to fire upon the enemy's center, the Emperor observed a mass of troops emerging from the woods of Chapelle Saint-Lambert, 6 miles to the northeast. This was 30,000 troops under Friedrich Wilhelm Freiherr von Below, and they were being followed by the bulk of the Prussian army. A hurried dispatch was sent to Grouchy, ordering him to rejoin the main body of the French army and engage below. but the message did not reach him until 5 p.m. By that point, Grouchy had become completely entangled with Johann Adolf Thielmann's Third Corps at Wavre, and even if he had been free to march at once, he could not have reached Napoleon until well after nightfall. Napoleon still hoped to defeat Wellington before the Prussians could arrive in force. 2 cavalry divisions were sent to form a screen in Belleau's path, and a corps under Georges Mortem Count de Lobau was placed behind them. This was done by 1:30 p.m. The battery near La Belle Alliance opened fire, and 18,000 infantry under Ney and Drought advanced on the Allied center a half-hour later, but many of the attackers marched in an unusual formation and were unable to fire effectively and were very vulnerable to enemy artillery. La Haye-Sainte was attacked but not taken, and Papelotte to the east was occupied. Henry Paget, Earl of Uxbridge, Wellington's cavalry commander, now threw this horseman against the disorganized French. The French executed a disciplined withdrawal from Papelotte, but in other areas they couldn't halt the advance of the enemy's cavalry. Fueled by their recent victories, Lord Edward Somerset and Sir William Ponsonby's cavalry disregarded Uxbridge's order to return and instead charged headlong into the French formations. Tragically, Ponsonby lost his life, and a significant number of English horsemen, amounting to a third of their force, perished in what proved to be a mostly futile action. Despite this setback, Wellington successfully overcame the initial crisis. Druitt's corps were pushed back from the slopes in front of the British lines, resulting in substantial casualties and the capture of 3,000 prisoners. At 3 p.m., the intensity of the battle momentarily subsided, except for the ongoing fierce combat at Hougoumont, where 1,200 Allied soldiers valiantly held off a significantly larger French force. Napoleon issued orders to Ney, instructing him to swiftly capture La Haye-Sainte in preparation for an impending assault by Druitt's and Reille's corps, along with elements of the Imperial Guard. Ney dispatched 2 infantry brigades to take La Haye-Sainte, but they were repelled. Subsequently, Ney made a perilous decision by committing the majority of the French cavalry to what would prove to be a fatal maneuver. Misinterpreting the movement of wounded soldiers and empty ammunition wagons from Wellington's center as a sign of weakness in the enemy's front, Ney brought Edouard Jean-Baptiste Milhaud's 2 cavalry divisions forward, believing this was his chance to tip the battle in his favor. Compounding this risky move without consulting his superiors, Charles Lefebvre Desnouettes ordered his cavalry division to follow Milhaud's lead. In response, the British formed infantry squares, defensive formations with multiple ranks that had proven highly effective in countering cavalry charges. Despite the French cavalry's determination, their massed attack had little chance of success, as it lacked infantry and close artillery support, facing unbroken British squares. The British artillery inflicted heavy casualties on the 5,000 cuirassiers advancing between Hougoumont and La Haye-Sainte. Uxbridge's remaining cavalry forced the cuirassiers to regroup, but their second attack also ended in failure. Although critical of Ney's premature use of unsupported cavalry, Napoleon decided to support Ney's actions. François-Etienne Kellermann's 2 cavalry divisions were sent to reinforce Ney, and they were joined by Claude-Etienne Guyot's division of cavalry from the Guard, possibly without explicit orders from Napoleon. Consequently, there were now 9,000 cavalry troops preparing to launch an attack on a front that had been reduced to just 500 yards due to the zones of fire around Hougoumont and La Haye-Sainte. Meanwhile, on the right flank of the French forces, at approximately 4:30 p.m., after an arduous 11-hour march through challenging terrain, the leading divisions of Belleau's Prussian forces initiated an artillery barrage from Paris Wood targeting the French cavalry screen. Lobau made the decision to confront the Prussian forces before Belleau could fully deploy his remaining troops, and he stood his ground, despite being increasingly outnumbered. Blücher, who was present with Belleau's corps, redirected the Prussian offensive toward Plancenoit, compelling Lobau to withdraw and allocate a brigade to defend the village. Overwhelming numerical superiority eventually forced the French to relinquish control of Plancenoit. In response, Napoleon dispatched Philippe Coulon Dulisme's division of the Young Guard to recapture it. Duhesme's successful action in Plancenoit alleviated the pressure on the French right flank temporarily. Between 5 and 5:30 p.m., Ney expended the last of his cavalry in desperate attempts to break through the British front lines. By 6 p.m., following the final cavalry charge, Ney finally ordered the advance of 6,000 infantry units that had been waiting less than a mile from Wellington's position. They faced heavy artillery and small arms fire, suffering a 25% casualty rate as they were swiftly repelled. In response to new orders, Ney managed to capture La Haye-Sainte. A battery positioned at the farm began to inflict significant damage on the British centre, which was only 300 yards away. Three of the diminished divisions that initiated the initial assault advanced toward the ridge, leading to a desperate hand-to-hand struggle. This marked the pivotal moment of the battle. The French needed to defeat Wellington's army before the arrival of another Prussian corps could tip the balance against them. Wellington's reserves were nearly depleted, with substantial casualties and desertions, leaving the centre vulnerable to further attacks from the fatigued French forces. On Wellington's far left, the French had retaken Papelotte for the second time, while bitter fighting persisted at Hougoumont on the right, until Hans Ernst Karl von Zieten's First Corps, which were approximately 3 miles away near Ohain, arrived. Wellington had no reinforcements available. Ney observed the wavering of Wellington's weakened centre and sent a request to Napoleon for a small infantry reinforcement. At this time, Napoleon declined to allocate any of the 14 Guard battalions held in reserve to Ney, as he was preoccupied with the situation on his right flank, where Duhesme had been forced out of Plancenoit by the Prussians. 2 battalions of the Old Guard were dispatched to Plancenoit, capturing it and pursuing the Prussian defenders 600 yards eastward, while Duhesme and the Young Guard regained control of Plancenoit. Around 7 p.m., with his flank secure, Napoleon turned his attention to the main front. Although he had ordered 6 battalions of the Guard to support Ney shortly after the recapture of Plancenoit, Wellington had been granted a 30-minute reprieve to reorganize his defenses. Zieten had finally arrived on the British left, releasing infantry and cavalry to reinforce Wellington's endangered centre. Wellington subsequently cleared the exhausted French troops from the ridge before they could be reinforced by the Guard, and silenced the artillery at La Haye-Sainte. Rather than taking the shortest route along the Brussels road, which provided significant cover, Ney led the 5 battalions participating in the assault across exposed slopes. 5 battalions of such skilled and resolute troops had little chance against the overwhelming numbers of enemy soldiers and cannons that blocked their path. The retreat of the survivors from the assault signaled to the troops in their rear and on their right that the battle was lost, initiating a chaotic and uncoordinated withdrawal. The Prussians had amassed substantial forces at Papelotte, and on the French right flank, the retreat turned into a rout. At around 8:15 p.m., just 15 minutes after the defeat of the Guard, Wellington ordered a general advance. The area around La Belle Alliance descended into tremendous chaos as the majority of the French army was driven back by the converging British and Prussian offensives. At 9:15 p.m., Blücher and Wellington met near La Belle Alliance, acknowledging each other as victors. They decided that the Prussians would continue the pursuit. Blücher positioned Below's corps at Genappe, approximately 5.6 miles southeast of the battlefield, from which they chased away large crowds of fleeing French troops. Gneisenau, with 4,000 men, pursued the French as far as Freyssens, which was 11 miles south of the Waterloo battlefield, driving hordes of panicked French soldiers ahead of him. This resounding victory came at a substantial cost. Wellington's casualties numbered 15,000, while Blücher's were approximately 8,000. Napoleon's forces suffered 25,000 killed and wounded, with 9,000 captured. Napoleon abandoned his defeated army, returning to Paris on the morning of June 21 and abdicating the following day. Between July 5th and 6th, the French army reluctantly began a march south of the Loire River, where it was eventually disbanded. The Allies entered Paris on July 7th, and Louis XVIII was restored to the throne the following day. Napoleon traveled to the west coast and, unable to execute his plans to escape to the United States due to interference from a British naval squadron, he surrendered to the commander of the HMS Bellerophon on July 15th. He spent the remainder of his life in exile on the island of St. Helena,